My guest today is Hyrum Lewis. He is an associate professor of history at Brigham Young University, Idaho, previously a visiting scholar at Stanford, and is a regular op-ed writer at the Wall Street Journal. But his writing today that we are concerned with is the new book, The Myth of Left and Right, How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. You can find that book and all of the other books mentioned on this program by going to mightyheaton.com/featured, and we talk to Hyrum now. Hello, Hyrum.
Hello, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.
I really enjoyed your book. When I started looking into it, I thought this is going to be a slam dunk greatest hits episode where I don't learn anything new. No offense to you. It's just that I've been touting this message myself for a very long time. You proved me wrong. I learned a bunch of stuff from your book. It was very enjoyable, and I'll add it was also a remarkably quick read for how much substance is in it, which I credit to your writing abilities.
Thank you. That's what we were aiming for, and I've long thought that you and I were kindred spirits, so I'm really glad to be here with you.
We definitely are. I think that I regularly deride the tribalism going on in modern American politics by referring to blue team and red team because I want people to think of it as a fairly ridiculous team sport more than as competing religions. And you make a great case for it in the book. So give us the thesis for the book, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So, our book is called The Myth of Left and Right because we're trying to expose a myth that almost everybody believes. So if you were to go to, say, Senator Elizabeth Warren, I'm just going to pick on her for a second, but I could pick any Republican politician or anybody at Fox News or anywhere else, anytime somebody's politically committed. And if you went to Senator Warren and you had a list of, say, the 10 policies that are priorities for the Democratic Party today, more affirmative action, higher taxes on the rich, more environmental protection, less control on abortion, more control on guns, the whole range of things. You said, Senator Warren, which of these do you believe in? She'd say, well, I believe in all of them. And you might say, well, that's a pretty remarkable coincidence. How is it that you just happen to believe all these things? I mean, a coin flip doesn't come up heads 10 times in a row. I mean, what's going on? And she'd say, well, I have a philosophy called progressivism. And since I adhere to the progressive philosophy and worldview, then I believe in all those principles because all those issues grow out of the progressive philosophy. That's what she said. So we call that the essentialist theory of ideology. She believes that there's some essence connecting everything called left-wing. All of the different policies, they seem unrelated, right? I mean, what does abortion have to do with tax cuts? And she would say, well, they're fundamentally about progressive change. And if you have the progressive philosophy where you believe in progress and changing things, well, then you believe in both, tax hikes and greater freedom for abortion rights. Right? She would say they're not unrelated, even though they seem to be unrelated. So that's the essentialist theory, and most people believe that. And if the essentialist theory is correct, well, then a political spectrum works to model politics. If politics really is about one essential value, change, and how you feel about change. If you really, really like change, you're on the far left. If you really, really hate change or want to turn back the clock, you're on the far right. But if that's really the only issue in politics and everything else is just a surface manifestation of that one underlying issue, then the political spectrum can work. But what we're saying in our book is that it's actually complete nonsense. There isn't one issue in politics. There really is no essence at all. And the evidence for an essence behind the political spectrum is nil. There's none. We're not aware of a single study in sociology, psychology, history, political science, economics, not a single one that can substantiate at all the existence of an essence. So why do people believe in the essentialist theory if there's no evidence for it? And we claim it's the same reason that people believe in astrology, because people can make up stories. I mean, what does being born in August have to do with being brave? The answer is nothing. But if I went to an astrologer's office and said, hey, I was born in August, she'd say, okay, well, that means you're brave. Really? And she'd say, yeah, tell me about your life. And I'd say, well, I went into the military. Oh, well, putting your life on the line for your country, that brave people go into combat. Well, what if I didn't serve in the military? Then she would say, oh, well, how brave of you to oppose your country's unjust wars, right? It's heads I win, tails you lose. And that's exactly what we see people doing in politics. When conservatives believe in free trade, we say, well, they'll say, well, obviously we believe in free trade. Free trade is a long-standing American tradition. And as conservatives, we believe in conserving traditions. So naturally, we're in favor of free trade. But now that conservatives are against free trade, you say, well, how is that? And they say, well, because protectionism preserves and conserves American jobs and conserves American manufacturing. So it's heads I win, tails you lose. You can cook up a story.
A great one for this is anything involving foreign policy. Like if you go back to Woodrow Wilson, World War I, the conservative position was, hey, George Washington said to stay out of entangling foreign wars. We conservatives believe America should be isolationist and neutral. And Woodrow Wilson said, no, as a liberal, I believe that the United States should be engaged with the greater global community and that it is our moral obligation to pursue the American values abroad. And that's the same with FDR. And then it flips. It completely flips during the Cold War, where if you're a Republican, now you're a war hawk, where you believe you have to push liberty abroad. And now the liberal position is being a peacenik pacifist character. And then George W. Bush, he's a warmonger, so that makes sense because he's a conservative. But then Trump is an isolationist, but somehow he's far right.
Exactly.
But now Biden comes in and he's not an isolationist. He's different than Trump. He also wants to engage. And if you're conservative, just phrase whatever the Democrats are doing as stupid, and that's the liberal position. It's like
right.
if you invade a country, that was dumb and America crusading abroad. But if you hold back, you're a coward. And then if the Republicans do it, you're a warmonger. And if you hold back, there's no element to it. There's no fundamental philosophy in any manifestation in American politics.
Completely right. And so the Iraq War is a great example. People said, well, George W. Bush is the most right-wing president in history. He's on the far right of the Republican Party. That was conventional wisdom. And I'd say, well, I thought conservatives believed in small government. No, that's not important. You can use big government for conservative ends, they would say. Okay, so what makes him so right-wing? Well, the Iraq War. I mean, he believes in being tough on terrorism, and toughness is a conservative value and standing up for America, blah, blah, blah. Well, if a Democrat would have been doing it, the policy would have been the exact same, but the story would have changed. And that's our ultimate point, is that stories persist, not philosophies, just like the astrological stories persist. The astrologer will tell the same story for somebody born in August, but they will wrap the same story around a whole different set of characteristics. And that's exactly what's happening here. So if a Democrat would have invaded Iraq, you're exactly right. They would have said, hey, we believe in social justice. We believe in equality and progress. What could be more progressive than bringing democracy and human rights to oppress people in the Middle East? You can use a progressive story to justify any policy. You can use a conservative story to justify any policy. But the reality is that they are just stories. And people who think, I'm a conservative, I stand for principles, are deluding themselves. They are simply going along with the tribe.
So in a moment, we'll talk about for me, the core of the book, what I really enjoy about the book, which is social theory of ideology, which is your explanation of why this mirage exists. But before we do that, I do want to hammer this home because there are a lot of people listening right now who are going to say, well, yeah, the essence of the left versus right isn't change versus progress. Obviously, the essence of the left versus right is government versus authoritarianism, or government versus markets, or there's some other duality that they're going to say, well, that's the real essence of left versus right spectral thinking. Can we counter that? Can you throw out some more examples of why that it doesn't end up panning out, why it is actually astrology at the end of the day?
Sure. I mean, because no matter what essence anyone proposes, it's easily falsifiable. That's what makes something rational and scientific, is if it's falsifiable. And every one of these hypotheses is indeed falsified. So if somebody puts forward, say, government versus freedom, well, then why wasn't George W. Bush considered to be on the far left of the political spectrum? He expanded the size of government more than any president in the history of our country in absolute terms, and then in percentage terms more than any other president besides FDR. I mean, the second most big government president of all time. So why is he then? Why didn't the left wing in this country say George W. Bush is our guy? Because it's tribal. They didn't like him because he was in the right-wing tribe. It has nothing to do with principle. If it had to do with, yes, we're on the left because we believe in big government, they would have said, God bless George W. Bush. He's our favorite president. We love this guy. Look at all the No Child Left Behind spending. Look at prescription drug entitlement.
Medicare Part D. There's lots of entitlement spending he did. He didn't cut it. He expanded it.
Expanded it radically. I mean, it went from 18% of GDP up to 26% during his presidency, the biggest expansion in history. So yeah, I mean, no essence works. You can just go down the list. We propose, 20 of the most popular ones in our book, but that's what everybody does. And it's like a game of whack-a-mole because people just keep, well, no, this is the real essence. And then we have to shoot down that one. No, this is the real essence. But they're all easy to shoot down. If for nothing else, because if big government, or if whatever essence was indeed the essence, then why are the policies that the left and right for constantly switching? I've heard people say, well, liberals are empathetic while conservatives are apathetic. Really? So why is it that empathy...
I know who came up with that label. I know who's designed that system.
Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, this empathy versus apathy. But if that's true, then why does empathy lead you to support the Iraq War 1 minute and oppose it the next? Or why does it lead you to support character in public officials 1 minute and oppose it the next? Why does it lead you to support free trade 1 minute and oppose it the next? I mean, it just doesn't work.
And the Republicans are a good example there. I think it was, you mentioned it in the book, Reagan's Secretary of Education had written an entire book about why Bill Clinton needs to be impeached because character matters in the president. It's not just about ideas and executing things. The moral fiber of the man is important to the role. And then he's in favor of Donald Trump years later. And it's very difficult to reconcile those two things if we're looking at it in terms of some deep cosmic essence that we're channeling through politics. Free trade's another great example where when I was a kid, free trade was the Republican thing and the Democrats were protectionist union people. And now the progressives are the free trade, globalist, interconnected, you idiots don't understand comparative advantage party, and the Republicans are the protectionist party. Like, how did that flip? And then I can add a couple more, like the spectral thinking makes sense if it's unidimensional. If we're only talking about one issue, all we're talking about is guns, then it makes sense to have a spectral analysis of if you're to the right, you're in favor of less gun restrictions. If you're to the left, you're in favor of more. But then you start adding these variables on top of each other. What if I'm opposed to all gun control and I'm super pro-choice? Well, by our current lexicon, I am then a centrist. If I am incredibly, I believe that you can abort the child up until it crowns and everybody can own a rocket. I'm a centrist. I'm a moderate, according to left-right thinking. It just doesn't make sense.
And that's why we are our single biggest solution to the problem of political discourse today, because the political spectrum, as you pointed out, and as you've hammered home on this show so well, just simply doesn't work. It's misleading. People say it's a useful heuristic. It's useful. Yeah, it's not perfect, but it gives us a good... No, it's not. It's not useful any more than the four humorous theory of disease was useful. It misleads and destroys and causes people to have all kinds of misinformation and false associations, and putting someone in the middle who is a radical pro-choice or a radical gun rights, and that just doesn't make any sense. It misleads, it misinforms. Okay, so what's the solution then? If you want to get rid of the political spectrum, this is the most common thing. You want to throw one out, you have to have something better. Well, actually, you don't. Doctors threw out the four humors theory, and they didn't come up with a new overarching model. They just went granular. They just talk about...
So previously, because I'm not super familiar with medical history, but previously doctors would, you have a carbuncle or some other old-timey disease, and the doctor would go, you've got too much bile, but you need to have more phlegm. I don't know what the humors were, right? And but there was sort of four spectrums or two spectrums or something where you're moving the needle of you're too acidic, but you need to be more alkaline kind of thinking. And they've eventually gone, well, that's stupid. Actually, cancer has very little to do with diabetes in terms of this instance. We're not going to treat it like a slide scale. We're going to treat every disease unique.
Sure. And imagine, people, no, we need the spectrum to bring order. What if doctors said we need the spectrum to bring order to medicine, and they put a fractured tibia with lung cancer? And you go into the doctor with a fractured tibia, and he says, "Oh, that's a left-wing illness, so let's give you chemotherapy." I mean, that's essentially, that's basically what we're doing in the political realm. Is somebody who is a radical, like you say, has all these positions, and yet we're lumping them all together. Historians lump together Thomas Sowell and Milton Friedman with Adolf Hitler.
Right.
Why?
Yes, the Jewish and black anti-government thinkers of the 20th century definitely had a lot in common with the anti-Semitic big government guy, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously it's nonsense, but once you subscribe to essentialism, well, then you say, well, actually, deep down, there's an essence they're connected to. What's your evidence for that essence? You have none. There's just no evidence for it. It's just a fun way to dismiss your enemies. It's a tool of tribal hatred. It's a way to say, don't listen to Thomas Sowell. Hate Thomas Sowell because he's like Hitler. What makes him like Hitler? They're both on the right. Why are they both on the right? Because they're both extremists in this right-wing philosophy. It's circular reasoning. You're like Hitler because you're right-wing, and you're right-wing because you're like Hitler.
I think that you have to end up talking yourself into this position that progressivism plus steroids is Stalin, but Hitler plus, or conservatism plus steroids is Hitler. And you start looking at the two and you're going, well, actually they're not, they had a lot of overlap. I do know there are anarchists that listen to the show who their spectrum would just be, it would literally be more or less government. And they would make the case that the ultimate binary or the ultimate spectrum is just, are you moving towards anarchy or are you moving towards statism? Is that okay because it's unidirectional, or is it a different model than the left-right model? How would you identify that?
Yeah. So I'm not against using spectra or spectrums, if you want to phrase it that way, when they're appropriate. So when we're measuring temperature, there really is such a thing as hot and cold. And a spectrum can measure really, really cold versus really, really hot. You can move along that one-dimensional scale. So if something is indeed one-dimensional, knock yourself out. Use a spectrum. That's terrific. That is a good way to model things. So if we're talking about that one issue, that one dimension of more versus less government, absolutely. Use a spectrum because it does model more versus less. But when we're talking about a political spectrum, now we're dealing in hundreds of distinct issues.
Right.
Sometimes the left wing wants more government. Sometimes they want less. They want more when it comes to, I don't know, social welfare spending, less when it comes to abortion restriction. They want more government when it comes to regulating the economy. They want less when it comes to military or whatever happens to be, right? So you can't capture that in a single dimension. So our solution to the problems is simply to go granular. Talk about what we're talking about. Instead of saying he's on the radical left, just say he believes in gun control. That's not that hard. And then you can place people, like you said, on a gun control spectrum. You would have extreme gun control over here, extreme anti-gun control over here, and then people like me are somewhere in the middle. Yeah, we think people ought to have the right to bear arms, but there's certainly limits, and I'm in favor of background checks and stuff like that. I mean, but to say, oh, you're on the liberal side and therefore you believe in big government too, it's simply not true. There's no connection between what I believe in gun control and my belief in abortion and believe in social welfare spending, taxes, tariffs, or anything else. And pretending that connection exists because there's a deep down worldview or philosophy is the single biggest political delusion of our time. And you and I are doing our best to puncture that delusion.
Very much so. Okay, this is helpful too. So you're not opposed to spectral analysis or spectral descriptions. It's just that when they're orthogonal to one another, or they're not on the same spectrum, and that when we start pretending that the Jackson Pollock painting is a straight line, that's the big issue. Is this sort of collective bundling? Well, so noting all of that, we're going to define essentialist theory as the idea that there is some inherent germ to conservatism or progressivism from which all other policies spring out. I think we've done a good job of giving that a black eye. What is the social theory of ideology?
The social theory, so the question people are trying to answer, because there is a correlation, right? So I'm saying that abortion and tax cuts are not connected at all. And believing in lower taxes and believing in abortion restriction has no intrinsic connection. But people would point out and say, but Hyrum, why do they correlate then? When I meet somebody and I know they're against abortion, I can, not 100%, but more than 50%, I can know that they're probably in favor of tax cuts. It would be a good bet, and I'd be wise to put my money down on the fact that they're in favor of tax cuts too. So, Hyrum, you have to explain that. And you're saying they're not connected, but it looks like they're connected. Otherwise, why do they correlate? And I'm saying they correlate because of socialization. So here's how it works. The essentialist theory that Elizabeth Warren believes, she says, I start with my philosophy. I'm a progressive. I have this progressive philosophy, change, social justice, whatever. And then using that philosophy, I think myself to all the policies called progressive. So that philosophy leads me to believe in higher taxes on the rich, in affirmative action, in abortion rights, in pacifism, all these different things. And then once I have all those positions that I've thought myself to, then I join the tribe. Then I join the Democratic Party. Then I start watching MSNBC and following certain people on Twitter because they're part of my group, my tribe, because we share the same philosophy. We are saying that is backwards. The social theory says Elizabeth Warren starts with the tribe. Now, how she got to the tribe is an interesting question. It might be because of socialization, right? I mean, she's a professor at the Harvard Law School, or used to be anyway, and most of her colleagues are in the progressive tribe too, so maybe just as a matter of, hey, fitting it. Or maybe you're born into a family that has a particular political inclination, and so you join the tribe for that reason. Or maybe, as Keith Stanovich just pointed out, there are psychological dispositions to certain positions, not to ideologies as a whole, but certain positions. Maybe I have an inborn disposition to believe in, hey, don't touch my money, get off, leave me alone kind of thing. And that will lead me to believe in, tax cuts. Okay. And then once you've anchored into the tribe, then you adopt everything else the tribe believes. Then you start watching Fox News. Then you start following certain people on Facebook. Then you go to Democrat or Republican Party rallies. Once you do that, then you start adopting, the pro-life position and the gun rights position and all the rest of it. And then you cook up the story last to explain how they're all conservative. That's when the astrology starts.
Right. So we join the group, and then we retcon ourselves into believing that there's some silver thread that's linking all of these other things. But the group identity is foremost, and then we rationalize how all the group beliefs are actually coming from this germ at the center of my political identity.
That's exactly right. And you say that's a pretty fantastic claim. I mean, you're really telling me that all these, Elizabeth Warren, a very smart person, Rush Limbaugh, he was also a smart person, pains me to say, Tucker Carlson, you name it, name your smart person. You're really telling me that they're all wrong, and that's indeed what I'm saying, that they are self-deluded. He said that's a pretty remarkable claim. But actually, the more you look into the recent psychological literature, you realize it's not such a strange claim after all, because we're finding more and more the human capacity for self-delusion is immense. And we can talk ourselves into things. And so the metaphor that Jonathan Haidt uses is the metaphor of the elephant and the rider. So the elephant is just going where it wants. The rider's not controlling it. But then once the elephant goes where it wants, the rider makes up a story saying, look at all these places I wanted to go, right? So the rider is like your reason, the elephant is like your emotions. And so you have all these tribal emotional commitments. And then you make up a story afterwards, wherever the tribe took you. Well, that's of course where I wanted to go. Of course I was going to support aid to, Ukraine. Of course I was going to support COVID restrictions. It's really funny because in 2003, there was all these psychologists saying that conservatism is defined by fear. And they went through and showed how conservatives were afraid of things, right? If you're a conservative, you're afraid of terrorism. And that's why you launched the Iraq War. You're afraid of abortion. You're afraid of this, that, the other. Came up with all these things that conservatives were supposedly fearful of. They said that's what makes a conservative is fear. Well, then along comes the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if we were doing prediction instead of astrology, we would have predicted that conservatives would have been the ones saying, hey, mask up 2-3 times, get your shots immediately, don't go anywhere, lock down. That's a conservative thing to do because we're the fearful people. We're cautious. Conservatism as caution is a very popular essence. But in fact, the exact opposite happened. Why? Nobody would have predicted it. It's entirely tribal because the left-wing tribe blue, said, hey, we've decided to be the really restrictive people on COVID. And Tribe Red said we're going to be the really lax people. And in other countries, it was different, right? In Sweden, it was considered left-wing to be more lax. So it's entirely so.
So in an alternate universe model where Trump comes out with a mask on, he puts masks on Mount Rushmore in a very Trumpian capacity. He gives a press conference where he says, as conservatives, we believe in protecting our neighbors and our community. That's why we're wearing masks. These hippie liberals that don't want to wear masks because they want to be free and open. They're bringing down the country. I am a wartime president. In that scenario, you'd see MAGA masks. You would have seen conservatives embracing masks. You would have seen lockdowns being described as a practical solution to an existential threat, et cetera, et cetera. And it could have gone. And I think even if people aren't going to believe me on that, you can definitely go back historically and look at prior to the Cold War, the socialist element in America was linked up with the religious element in America. Like if you were super religious, you saw a correlation of well, Jesus wants me to share. Socialism involves sharing. And so the socialist elements in the United States were not considered anti-God. And even in more modern history, up until you had Roe v. Wade, that kind of Christian bloc was not dedicated to either camp. But once I'm a single issue voter and I'm I am very pro-life, well, now I'm going to be in the Republican Party, and then I'm going to get acculturated to all the other stuff and go, oh, well, our group believes in low taxes, and our group this month believes in free markets. And I now believe all those things because my group identity is important to me.
Oh, that's exactly right. And if you go back historically, it really is interesting because people say, oh, he became conservative like when he had a religious conversion. That would have been seen as becoming radical, having a religious conversion in the 1890s or the 1930s or anywhere else. I mean, we say, oh, George W. Bush was so right-wing because he was a theocrat. He was bringing his private religious views into politics, and that's a right-wing theocratic thing to do. In 1896, the most theocratic presidential candidate in history was William Jennings Bryan. And we now call William Jennings Bryan, we now call him a radical leftist because he was in favor of nationalizing railroads, redistributing wealth, expanding the money supply, all these things so it's what religion is connected to. Whether religion is connected to more socialism or left is entirely context dependent. I mean, you can go international too. The Taiping Rebellion in China in the late 1850s, early 1860s. One of the bloodiest civil war in the history of the world. It was launched by a bunch of theocrats, right? They were trying to establish a kingdom of heavenly peace, and this huge war to try to establish a socialist society based on Christian principles. So yeah, the idea that Christianity and free markets and tax cuts go together, that's entirely socially constructive. There is nothing natural about it.
Okay, so I'm 100% with you on all of this, and I'm gladdened by this. When does this happen to us? So, like, I know based on prior reading that the left-right idea comes from the French Revolution in the extremely universally applicable situation of royal vetoes. That the French Assembly, the people on the right thought that the king should have veto power. The people on the left thought the king should not have veto power. Is that from that moment on, are Jefferson and Hamilton going, well, I'm left-wing and you're right-wing, and all of American politics has always glommed onto this? Does it happen later? When do we start suffering under this left-right delusion?
Yeah. So as best we can tell, there was no use of a political spectrum in American politics, or at least no public use of it that I'm aware of, in journalism or among presidential speeches or anything like that, until the 1920s. So
really?
What happened? Yeah. So if you go back, you can do this very simply. You could do it right now, Andrew. You could just jump on Google Ngram Viewer and look at the word left-wing, right-wing, and you would see it's just flat, basically zero, close to zero. I mean, people would use the terms left-wing and right-wing, but they're describing architecture. The left wing of my house, right?
Yeah.
Or football. The left wing of the line pushed back the defense, or the left-wing hockey players, or the left wing of our military formation. So they'd use these terms, but never in a political sense, as far as I can tell. So yeah, they were using it in France, but it didn't cross the Atlantic until the 1920s into American political discourse. It was very late coming. It's 100 years old now, basically. And our claim is 100 years is enough of the madness. 100 years is enough of the nonsense. It's time to stop. Now, having said that, why did it take such deep root if it was so obviously absurd? There's many dimensions to politics. I don't think it's because everybody was astrologically thinking. I think it's because it actually worked initially. Because when the political spectrum first took hold in the 20s and 30s, there was just one big national issue on the table, and that was the New Deal. When Roosevelt said, are you a liberal or conservative, he was entirely talking about one thing. Do you support my New Deal? I mean, you had KKK members that he called liberals because they supported the New Deal. That was considered left. And if you want to move to the left, it meant more government, less government. So that's why, you hear that essence quite a bit. Liberal is left, big government, conservative is small government, because that used to be true back in the 1930s. And so it was useful back then. We were really measuring just one dimension of politics, more versus less government intervention in the economy. Do you support the New Deal? Then you're on the left. If you're against it, you're on the right. If you're even more extreme than the New Deal, you're on the far left and you want communism, socialism, something like that. And if you're extreme right, you want anarchism or whatever it happens to be. So it worked for a while. The problem is unidimensionality quickly gave way to multidimensionality because new issues became nationalized. So you mentioned in the 1950s, foreign policy suddenly became partisan. And so when Harry Truman was invading Korea, people said, oh, that's typical liberal big government, and so they were against it. Well, then Democrats started stepping down from foreign policy interventionism, especially with Vietnam, and they said, you're right, bring American troops home, we're pacifists, that's now left-wing. And so now you had Democrats in favor of big government in some realms, in favor of small government in other realms. And so now it's complicated. You bring in racial issues and affirmative action, you bring in abortion, Roe v. Wade, you bring in all these new things coming online, and now a one-dimensional model doesn't work anymore. So instead of people saying, okay, more than one issue, we can't use the spectrum, instead they said, no, there's still an essence to liberal and conservative, and all these new issues, we can fold it into that paradigm. That was the big moment of error.
Well, so this is fascinating to me because I've just sort of always assumed that the moment that the French Assembly came up with left-right, everyone in the world went, brilliant, yes, 100%. There is very much an essence to this. We're on board. But you could disprove that very quickly. Like I would imagine you could also do, like I will later today get on ChatGPT and go read through all of the Federalist Papers, all of the anti-Federalist Papers, and all of the existent letters of any founding father, and tell me how many times the term left, right, left-wing, or right-wing comes up. I've not done this yet, but taking you that you've already done your research, Hyrum, probably not a lot. That just was not part of the cognitive landscape of the American Republic up until the 20s.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. And so again, did anyone say it anywhere? I'm not going to say no, right? It's impossible to prove a negative, especially as a historian. But was it common political discourse? The answer is no. I'm not aware of a single time that Abraham Lincoln said left wing and right wing. I'm aware of plenty of times where he talked about specific issues. I'm in favor of more tariffs. I'm in favor of railroad subsidies. I'm against slavery, right? He was smarter than we are. He would go granular and talk about specific issues. He didn't use the ridiculous language of my opponent's on the far left and I'm on the right wing, or whatever it happens to be. So yeah, this came very recently. You start to see it creep in the late 19-teens. And the reason for that is the Bolshevik Revolution was heating up. So they kind of resurrected that French Revolution, those French Revolution terms. And so the Bolsheviks, and this is why Hitler was considered right-wing, by the way. It's pretty interesting. So the Bolsheviks, they wanted to place on a spectrum not big government versus small government so much, but different kinds of socialists. So they said, here we are, we're all socialists. Are you a radical Bolshevik socialist, or are you one of kind of the people that Karl Marx criticized as kind of these squishy Owenite socialists, or whatever it happens to be? So they had
Mensheviks or whoever was Yeah,
they were always talking about competing factions of socialists. And so the bad socialists are on the right wing, we good socialists are on the left wing. And so what happened is that newspaper reporters who were reporting on the Russian Revolution would use that language, but not to describe American politics. They're only talking about what's going on in Russia. They're just reporting. Well, unfortunately, then certain people in America started importing it and saying, well, we can talk about left and right in our political parties too. And so you see right around the year 1919, 1920, people like Senator La Follette start using the term left and right to describe, hey, we're the progressives, we're the left-wingers, we're the good guys, and the evil people who are against progress are right-wingers. Now, as far as I can tell, people didn't take the bait, people who were against the New Deal. Like Ayn Rand, for instance. I don't know that she ever called herself a right-winger. She just said, I'm against the New Deal. I'm an individualist. That's the term she would use, right? She was very almost religious about the term individualism. It's in the late 1940s that people like Bill Buckley and Russell Kirk start cooking up a story saying, yes, change versus preservation is the one essential issue, and we are on the preservation side. As Bill Buckley phrased it, we are standing against history, yelling, stop. We don't like progress. And so our policies, our anti-New Deal policies are defined by hatred of progress. They finally took the bait, and it's been an uphill battle ever since, because the preservation story is a much less attractive than the progressive story. You say, look, we have had progress for thousands of years, technological progress, progress in human rights, progress in getting rid of slavery, civil rights, giving women the vote, progress. And now you're telling us to stop it? You're telling us to stop progress? I mean, how dumb can conservatives be? How dumb can people in the red tribe be to handicap themselves with such a ridiculous story?
Well, what I find interesting about this is it's so difficult to describe past American presidents without using left-wing, right-wing terminology, and everybody does it. Weirdly, everybody claims to be a descendant of Jefferson. Like all of the conservatives I know believe they are the true heirs to Jefferson, who was the first right-wing president, and then all of the Democrats I know simultaneously are Jefferson minus the slavery. They're quick to point that out, but they're Jeffersonians, right? I look at it and I'm like, it is. I think there's such a different set of issues back then that it becomes really difficult and nonsensical to start talking about how Martin Van Buren is more right-wing than Jackson, because they're talking about the bank and stuff. So we've retconned all of this. Like, Jackson is not saying I'm a left-winger or a right-winger. Alexander Burr is not saying I'm a right-winger and my opponent Hamilton is a left-wing. There is no right versus left thinking in American history up until maybe 1918, but really a bit of the 20s and functionally in the 40s and 50s. That's just not how people thought of themselves, described themselves. Lincoln was not talking about himself as I'm on one side of the spectrum representing something, and Stephen Douglas is on the other side of the spectrum.
Yeah, and you'll notice that it's always self-serving too, right? I mean, it's like a strange baptism of the dead type of thing, right? You're trying to recruit all the heroes of history to your side. And it's really silly. And since most historians, sadly, I mean, this is just a tragedy, college professors who should be the most open-minded, independent thinking, and yet they become so tribal. They are just lockstep with everything. It's sad. I go to American Historical Association conferences, and everybody has the exact same views. And I think to myself, you people are always bragging about how independent you're, a critical thinker, and this and that, and yet you just sign up for everything one tribe believes. It's silly. So when you open an American history textbook, because most historians are tribe blue, you'll basically just see a recruitment of every hero. Liberals like
so
Lincoln.
Lincoln is very much
Conservatives,
tribe blue.
Douglas. Oh, of course. Of course. And they won't say tribe blue, right? They think there's an essence. No. We stand for social justice. And Lincoln stood for social justice. Therefore, Lincoln is on my side, and he was a liberal. But then there was evil Stephen Douglas, right wing, and he was the bad guy. And so if you are today a conservative, please understand that you are in the same tradition as right wing Stephen A. Douglas and John Calhoun and all these other slaveholders. I mean, this is a sneaky, slimy tactic of disinformation. Conservatives, of course, do it too. You see George Will saying, ooh, make sure you know that today's progressives supported eugenics. No, they don't. Well, they did once upon a time. That's just you retroactively stuffing them in a different category. There are different issues at each period, and we can't, first of all, pretend there's only one issue, and two, issues that are long gone, we can't pretend they somehow fit in our current day categories. So you read a history textbook, and every hero of the past is placed on a spectrum, and it's just silly. There is no spectrum, and there was no spectrum. We need to stop misinforming people who read history books and just talk about the facts, just talk about the positions. Spectra just mislead.
Yeah, I think to your earlier point, if we are actually talking about a spectrum where we're just talking about, do you want government more involved in economics, then it becomes useful. We can start using terminology like that. When we try to come up with a unified field theory of jurisprudence, foreign policy, social policy, economics, and proceduralism, all orthogonal to one another, what I find is that the binaries we start concocting are just very polite ways of saying, well, there's a group of stupid shitbags, and there's the good people. And I get it. Like you mentioned earlier, and I'm sure that the conservatives have the same thing, but the empathy versus apathy, I'm confident whoever came up with that was a progressive.
No question.
Or the fear one, that was a progressive. But like, if maybe I think one of the things you mentioned in the book is like courage versus something else. Like that, it could well be that a conservative came up with that. And it ends up being the self-serving thing. You mentioned, by the way, that your cohorts and the professoriate are very much believers in essentialism and the idea that there is some quintessential philosophical germ that's the nucleus of these two competing realms. I would assume on first glance that the more educated you are, the more principled you are, the more you understand underlying ideology, the more you're going to have, a true libertarian, a true conservative, true progressive would believe this. That's just tribal garbage from the lemmings. But I personally am inured to this. Is that the case?
It is. Sadly enough, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to believe the essentialist theory. So the comment come back to us is then, well, isn't that proof that it's true? I mean, smart people are more likely to believe in facts like, that the planet is warming. Smart people are more likely to believe in facts like certain scientific theories or whatever. So is that clear that means essentialism is true if smarter people are more likely to believe it? No, because once you do a controlled experiment and you control for socialization, then intelligence has nothing to do with acceptance of the essentialist theory. So it's socialization causing it. So why are more educated people more thinking in terms of left-wing, right-wing? Because our education system is saturated with the false model. The education system, from the time you are, in third grade, I had my teacher going to the board and drawing a line and saying the Democrats are here, the Republicans are here, where are you on this line? Over on the far end of this line is Stalin and then the communists over here. I was getting that my whole life. So the more years you spend in school, the more likely you are to believe in that magic imaginary line, the same way that the more education you had in medicine in the 19th century, you were more likely to believe in the four humors theory. Didn't have to do with its truth. It had to do with that's the theory, the false theory that was taught in medical institutions. So you look at today, so we know it's false because the essentialist theory doesn't correlate with intelligence. It only correlates with socialization. Second, because people like Philip Tetlock have done a great deal of empirical predictive work, and they've looked and saw, okay, if this is true, that there is an essence, then understanding that should make you a more accurate thinker. You should be able to make more accurate predictions because this is a good predictive model. Models, by definition, are good if they're predictive, bad if they're not predictive. It turns out that when you make forecasts based on the political spectrum, your forecasts are terrible. Philip Tetlock said that's one of the central issues that defines somebody who forecasts poorly. My super forecasters, says Tetlock, are those people who don't think in terms of a spectrum. Now, they think in terms of multiple spectrums. They might say more versus less this, more versus less that, more versus less military spending, gun control, abortion restriction, whatever it happens to be. But they don't think in terms of left and right. That's a key characteristic. If indeed there was a truth and educated people discovered that truth, Tetlock would have found the opposite. So yeah, it's amazing and sad and tragic, Andrew, that the professoriate in this country has bought into the essentialist lie more than anyone, because they're the most educated, they're the smartest. They should be leading the way against this thing. So I think that's why shutdown culture is so prominent on campus, because the essentialist theory tells you, well, since there's only one issue, progress, social justice, or conservatism and, evil stopping progress and stopping social justice and hierarchy or whatever it is, I don't have to think once I've chosen the correct side. All I have to do is say, I'm in favor of social justice. Therefore, I can now adopt everything the blue team believes. And I know I'm right about all those things. The thinking is done. Because once I've chosen the correct side of the one big issue, social justice, then I already have prepackaged for me, well, here you go. Here's everything that promotes social justice. So if you are a campus radical who believes in social justice and says, oh, all these things promoted, I don't have to debate the question of affirmative action. I don't have to debate the question of tax cuts, the minimum wage, this or that policy, because I already know what's correct. I am omniscient. The political spectrum is so exceedingly evil because it gives people the illusion of omniscience and it kills their humility. It tells them you have all the answers. There's nothing you can learn. And if you have nothing you can learn, why would you ever dialogue? Why would you ever listen? So of course they're shutting down speakers. Of course they're silencing dissent. Of course they're running people out who disagree. Why wouldn't they? If you know everything, why would you listen to somebody who is a priori wrong? And that's what the political spectrum does. And it's absolutely tragic.
Well, and something that you posit that had never occurred to me before is that there was sort of previously a life cycle in American politics where there are going to be two dominant parties, but they're going to underserve some particular interest group or ideological niche. And so a third party will rise up and it will redistribute the landscape. And if we go back to like the very, very beginning of the Founding Fathers, it's kind of cliques. It wasn't really even parties. It was just, I like we're from Virginia. We're all hanging out. And I like Aaron Burr. He seems like a good guy, whatever. And then we kind of get into a period where it's not this essentialist philosophy. It's almost like just grocery baskets. The Democrats the Democrat Republican Party has this stuff in their grocery basket, and the Whigs have stuff in their grocery basket. And third parties arose by going, you know what, I've got stuff in my grocery basket that I'm not finding in either of these baskets, so I need a new grocery basket. But that as essentialism starts to take hold in the 40s, instead of looking at it like shopping between grocery baskets, we increasingly looked at politics as a Manichaean battle between blue and red cosmic entities, and there's not really a way for this basket approach to surface there. Am I reading your theory correct?
That's exactly correct. Yeah. So the grocery store metaphor is a good one because, look, people sometimes say, "Oh yeah, I agree. We need a third party." When they talk to us, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying we need a third party. We're saying we got to get rid of the spectrum. Those are two different things. So two political parties may be the best way to organize a democracy. It has a lot to recommend it. I'm not totally convinced of that, but maybe. But if you have two parties, it's as if you went to the grocery store. And Andrew, if you went today, you'd go in and just select all the products you like. Oh, I like kale, I like tortillas, I like 2% milk, whatever it happens to be. And then you'd leave. Well, what if they showed up and they said, Andrew, you either have to choose cart A or cart B? You'd say, well, darn, that's too bad. But I see the milk, the tortillas, and the kale in this cart. And even though it has Twinkies in there, darn, I don't like Twinkies so much, but I'll get that cart anyway because it has more of the things I like. That's how we should approach voting. If you have to vote for a Republican or Democrat, it should be a case of, yeah, not everything this party believes is correct, but it has more of the stuff I like. That shouldn't be too hard. That would be rational. But instead of that, we've been irrational. We go to the cart and say, no, actually, there's a philosophy connecting everything in cart A. And therefore, everything in cart A is better than everything in cart B. And you'd make up a story. You say, well, everything in cart A is healthy. And I would say, Andrew, what about those Twinkies? Well, actually, eating some Twinkies once in a while helps cleanse your system. Right? You'd have some big story you could tell about how the Twinkies actually were healthy. And then when the Twinkies got moved to the other cart, you'd say, of course, I hate Twinkies. I've always hated Twinkies. Right? This is what you see people doing when they reverse on issues when their parties change. They justify it by pretending there's a philosophy. There's not. These parties are just baskets. So that's why we haven't seen the rise of a third party since the political spectrum took hold, or at least of a major third party, since the political spectrum took hold. We had all kinds of third parties popping up in the first 150 years of our republic's history. And they would get a lot of votes, and they would even dethrone the previous parties. But that's not happening now. Why? Because instead of saying, hey, we have an issue that's really important for us, we're really against slavery, and neither the Whigs or the Democrats are addressing that, so we're going to start a new party, and called the Republicans to get rid of slavery. Now people just say, well, one party is left-wing, one party is right-wing, one party is correct about everything, one's wrong about everything. And so you're not principled. And as your party changes, instead of saying, well, I disagree with my party and I'm starting a new one, they say, no, this must be part of the philosophy because there's an underlying essence there. So the parties, the duopoly, they love the political spectrum. They love it. Because I want you to imagine if you got a fundraising letter from the Democratic Party and they said, dear Andrew Heaton, please donate to the Democratic Party. You have to understand, Andrew, that the forces of right-wing fascism are on the rise. And the cause of progress is threatened by the evil right wing. And our policies and every policy the Democratic Party believes is advancing the cause of social justice. You must give. You're much more likely to give money than if they wrote you a letter saying, dear Andrew, we're the Democratic Party. We stand for a bunch of stuff that's good, a bunch of stuff that's bad, but, nobody's perfect. Please donate. I mean, the first letter is much more likely to get donations and drum up support. So the myth of left and right, the delusion that there's only one issue in politics, is very convenient for the two parties. They love this myth, and so they are propping it up.
I'm with you 1,000% there. I think that it is left-right thinking is extremely useful for getting people to do what you want and getting money out of it, because you're able to reduce people to an us versus them model. If we get into kind of evolutionary psychological theory, kinship bonds are very difficult and very long to kinship bonds take a long time to develop. For you and I to really, really trust each other, we need to spend a lot of time hanging out. We need to go kill some elk together. We need to sleep near each other. It takes a long time. But if we're complete strangers and a tiger comes over the hill, we will immediately pretend we're brothers. We will until the tiger recedes, we will assume everybody here is a very, very intense family member, because that's a good evolutionary strategy. When the emergency recedes, we go back to normal operations. If you're in politics, getting people to go into tiger mode is very useful to you, because then everybody gets lockstep on your side. So again, I'm with you 1,000% on all of this, but I'm beginning to get like a little bit of niggle at the back of my mind that I need you to address. So I like George Will. I don't think George Will doesn't have a philosophy. I think he very much has a philosophy. He wrote a book on a philosophy, and George Will left the Republican Party on the theory that the Republican Party was no longer truly conservative. And there were a lot of never-Trumpers that did the same thing. Would you say George Will is not principled or does not have a political philosophy? Or is it that is something separate than left-right spectrum? Can you clarify the difference?
Yeah. So let me clarify. I was a little bit hard on George Will earlier because
no,
of
it's okay,
one
because
thing
we're
he
also
said.
piling on Elizabeth Warren. I think it's a good idea to do this, but I know that I consider myself very ideologically driven, and I think about ideology a lot, best practices and things like that. I don't think it's just acculturation. I think there are principles that I hold, right? So is it all illusional? Is it completely just I'm trying to fit in with the misfits or whatever, or is it that principles and ideology are on a separate track than the left-right spectrum?
Let me be very clear. Yes, thank you. When we say ideology and the essentialist theory of ideology, we are only talking about left-right ideologies. That's it.
Okay.
It's possible ideology in the broader sense, right? Some people consider religions ideologies, or a strong belief in abortion rights an ideology. Different conceptions of ideology. We're only talking about left and right. So let's use George Will as an example. I'm a fan, not because I agree with him on everything, but because he is not tribal. He does criticize the tribe. I do think he's philosophically based. I do think you're philosophically based. So it's not that nobody is philosophically based. We're just saying that what is considered left-wing and right-wing is not philosophically based.
Got it.
So
okay.
Could you be somebody who says, yes, I'm a conservative and I oppose change, and therefore I oppose the Iraq War because I don't like change? Absolutely. Knock yourself out. What we're saying, though, is a conservative philosophy doesn't lead to a specific set of policies that are all bound and then could be modeled on a political spectrum. Because you could have hundreds of different philosophies, not just two, progress or conservative. Right? There's a lot of different values. There's the freedom value. There's the egalitarianism value. There's the change value. There's the realism value. There's lots of values. The spectrum tells us there's just one. And furthermore, you have this idea, George Will, what he would say is, well, I'm a true conservative. The Republican Party is no longer conservative. Well, one, it never was. That was always just a story the Republicans told themselves to justify their policies. And two, by saying there's such a thing as a true conservative, George Will has just conceded the point. He's saying there's the left wing and the right wing, and now there's a true conservative that doesn't fit on the spectrum. Great. So what you're saying, Mr. Will, is the political spectrum doesn't work. And he would probably say, yeah, you're right, because it can't put me on the spectrum. I'm not in the middle. I don't believe, well, here's big government, here's smaller government, and I'm somehow in favor of some big government. No, I mean, he's very turned against big government in recent years. He's become much more libertarian in his views. So he doesn't fit on the spectrum. Furthermore, Trump is big government. Elizabeth Warren's big government. If you believe in small government, I'm somewhat libertarian in my views. Where do I fit? I don't. I'm not like halfway. Well, here's Elizabeth Warren who wants to spend 50% of GDP on the federal government. Here's Donald Trump who wants 25%, and I'm in the middle. I want 40%. It's simply not true. I want 15%. I think that would be about right for federal spending. The spectrum doesn't work in that sense. So as soon as you start using the true conservative argument, you have conceded our point that the spectrum doesn't work. If there's progressives, conservatives, then true conservatives, then true egalitarians and true realists and all these other groups, well, then you're right. Now we're looking at dozens and dozens of different groups and not just two. Prove the point.
Got it. Okay, so this is very helpful. So like to rely on another metaphor, if we were talking about religion, we could say there is a thing called Catholicism. There is a thing called Protestantism. There is a body of thought between these two religious set of principles and beliefs. The issue that you have is trying to make all religion a spectrum of Protestant to Catholic, where we're going, yes, Jews are very Protestant in terms of papal infallibility, but they're very Catholic in terms of traditionalism, and Muslims are, oh my God, they're super Protestants. But atheists, they're ultra Catholics. Like, that's the dumb part, is we can say, no, there is Islam, there is Judaism, there is atheism. It's trying to say that all the religions have one essential characteristic that we can put on a unispectrum. That's the fallacy there.
Thank you. That's a wonderful analogy. I'm going to use that because I love it.
Please do. I came up with that, but we're fighting the same fight, so take it and run with it.
I will.
Okay, so that's up. So there are philosophies there, and then historically speaking, then the parties would be a grab bag of philosophies, and then there's also going to be stuff that maybe doesn't apply to the philosophy. So, like, I would say, like, I think libertarians probably are more ideologically coherent. They're a lot smaller, and so there's more of a concentration there. But even then, you get into like jurisprudence or something, and I think it would break down in terms of what is the essential libertarian jurisprudential model. I don't know that you'd have to be an originalist or a living constitutionalist or a robust. I don't know. That would seem orthogonal to me. You could still pick and find. You could find things that would not be on that particular spectrum or that are unrelated to that particular ideology that are still kind of a grab bag even then.
Absolutely. I mean, originalism, what does that have to do with small government? Well, in some cases, it'll militate in favor of it. Sometimes it'll militate against it, right? You can make an originalist case for many different policies. So you're saying, libertarianism. Judge Posner is probably the most notable libertarian judge in the country the last 50 years. And yet he's a legal realist. He believes, you look at the consequences. You don't consult the original text and so forth.
Well,
and furthermore, you get to this idea of, well, all left policies are driven by egalitarian. Look, if you were really driven by egalitarianism, then, okay, maybe you'd be more in favor of redistribution of wealth, although the case of China suggests the opposite, that people were actually more egalitarian once the government turned to a more market model. But, okay, be that as it may, you might believe in more redistribution of wealth, but you'd probably be more in favor of school choice. So why is it that Tribe Blue is against school choice? I thought they were egalitarians. I thought they believed in social justice. Why are they happy with keeping minority and poor people in failing schools? And the answer is because the teachers' unions are a central component of Tribe Blue. So you say, well, the tribes are collections of philosophies. I would say it's more collections of interest groups that then concoct a story ex post. So why do they oppose school choice? Because the teachers' unions don't want the school choice. And so then they concoct a story about social justice around believing in these failing schools. You could just as easily concoct a story the way. So, I'm a conservative. I believe in conserving. Really? Do you believe in conserving the environment? No, that's green. That's left.
Barry Goldwater did. Barry Goldwater, who no one would accuse of being a namby-pamby left-wing liberal, was also in favor of gay rights, and he considered the environment a legitimate thing to conserve. That was a part of the American government's remit. That kind of thing, yeah. And it was kind of up in the air. That was like no one knew whether environmentalism was going to go left or right up until about Gore. Like George H.W. Nixon created the EPA. George H.W. Bush had re-signed the last big sweeping environmental legislation, and it could have gone the other way. It could have been that we see environmentalism as conservation, and that becomes it becomes guys in cowboy hats walking through the woods and the forest talking about how much they love nature and gods and all that. But as it was, it went with Gore, and it became a left-wing thing. But there's nothing inherent to it. There's nothing about like the environment that is inherently something on the progressive side or the conservative side, because that falls into the fallacy that there is some spectrum that would fall along.
Well, sure. And notice that if you ask a progressive, well, what do progressives believe? They would say social justice. What is social about the environment? The answer is nothing. Like, by definition, the environment is not social. And if you look at environmental policies, if you're restricting carbon emissions, who is that going to hurt most? The poor, right? If you believe in social justice, these environmental restrictions, I'm not saying they're bad. We may need these environmental restrictions to stop climate change and so forth. I have all the information on that. I'm just saying that if you look at who these restrictive environmental policies fall hardest on, is they raise prices on the most crucial and essential commodities that are going to afflict poor people the most. I mean, rich people can fly around in their private jets. Rise in the price of gasoline is not going to kill them. They're going to be fine. It's the poor people who are on the margins who are then going to have to, they can't do their job anymore because it's too expensive to get to work across town or whatever it happens to be. So we keep coming back to this point. Any set of policies can be wrapped in any story, astrology-wise, and they're doing that. And then the point about Goldwater, I love it because, Goldwater, they said, with Goldwater, the Republican Party finally became conservative. Before that, it was kind of middle of the ground Eisenhower. So here you had Senator Taft. He was considered extreme right-wing, but conservative guy. And then Eisenhower in 52 defeated him for the Republican nomination and defeated the forces of right-wing in the party and made it moderate. Okay, what did Taft believe? He was against the New Deal. He was against racism, much more so than Harry Truman or Franklin Roosevelt or any other Democrat at the time. Go look it up; it's true. And then he was against foreign policy interventionism. Fast forward, 50, 60 years, and now suddenly every one of those positions was associated with the opposite tribe. It's amazing. So what's considered conservative is entirely dependent on context. Goldwater believed in higher taxes. When John F. Kennedy went to cut taxes on the rich primarily. In the early 1960s, Goldwater said, no, this is inflationary. Tax cuts create budget deficits. As a conservative, I am against debt, and these tax cuts are irresponsible. And then I also don't like what Kennedy is doing with all his proposals and Johnson with the Great Society and all that. Big government and tax cuts are irresponsible. Fast forward to George W. Bush. It was big government and tax cuts that was considered right-wing. The exact opposite policies. So Goldwater's a right-winger for believing in tax hikes and small government. Bush is a right-winger for believing in tax cuts and big government. It really is amazing the mental gymnastics you have to do to try to maintain this idea that somehow Goldwater and Bush were the same. They shared the same philosophy. It's simply not true. They shared a tribe, not a philosophy.
All right. So noting this, and I'm with you on all these things. What do we do, Professor? Because it is deeply entrenched. I imagine you, me, and a lot of the people listening to the program feel like we're butting our head against a wall. I'm in media. I assume that I could at least reform how I'm describing things. So what would you recommend for listeners? What would you recommend for people in media or people in academia or all of the above?
Yeah, a few suggestions. First of all, recognition, right? Isn't that anytime somebody has to repent, right? Change their life. Recognition is the first step. You got to realize you're wrong. And most people haven't made it to that stage. So just realizing what we're saying, that it's about tribe, not philosophy when it comes to left, and there is no left-right spectrum. That'll do wonders. And then once you get to that step, then I think it's useful to try to change the way we talk. Don't capitulate. The same way if I was a doctor in the 19th century, I wouldn't be calling a patient, oh, he's a sanguine, oh, he's melancholic, oh, we got to bleed this guy or whatever. I would change the way I talk to just talk about specific ailments and specific treatments. So that's what we're encouraging people to do. Instead of talking about where are they on a spectrum, he's left-wing, he's right-wing, he's liberal, conservative, just say what they believe, for crying out loud. That's not too hard. In favor of affirmative action, against affirmative action. Please do us that courtesy. Now, here's where the problem comes, is because people do subscribe to this myth, they do themselves think of themselves as belonging to a philosophy. And sometimes we capitulate and say, well, he's on the far left because we're talking about, AOC or whoever who adopts the lockstep. We would say just change the wording a little bit. Instead of saying far left as if there's a line and AOC is on this line because she's strongly in favor of progressive change and capitulating to the delusion, instead say she is in tribe blue. That's true. She is a tribal person. She conforms to everything her tribe does and then takes all those tribal positions to an extreme. She doesn't exist on a line. She's just extremely tribal. So say that. That'll, one, be accurate. And two, hopefully it'll start shaming people out of this. People like to say, yes, I'm a progressive. I stand for social justice. That sounds good. Saying, well, I'm a tribal lemming. I just go along with my tribe. That doesn't sound as good. So the reality is the Senator Warren believes all those things on that list that we gave her because she's conformist. That doesn't sound good. She doesn't want to recognize that. That's the truth. But she has deluded herself. Smart person though she is in denial. She's deluding herself that actually all of these grew out of a deeply held philosophy. So if you and I can start talking that way, maybe it's a fool's errand. I don't know. But I refuse to use the terms left-wing, right-wing, liberal, conservative, other than in quotes or to add the word tribe before it. I usually just say he's a red, he's a blue if I have to talk about collectives. If I don't have to talk about collectives, I simply talk about policy. So changing the way we talk can do that. Another thing is we can do adversarial collaboration. And so some people say, oh, get a left-winger and a right-winger to talk. No, that's not the right thing to do, right? So if we were like, if we wanted to do a study about the effects of immigration, oh, you get a left-winger like Paul Krugman and then a right-winger like Brian Kaplan. Left-wing Paul Krugman is in favor of open borders or more immigration. Right-wing Brian Kaplan is in favor of open immigration. It's not going to do anything. So instead of being open, adversarial collaboration based on a fiction of a line, instead be in favor of adversarial collaboration based on individual policies. Find somebody who's more in favor of immigration and somebody who wants more restrictive, and then conduct studies about the effects of immigration where both people design the study ahead of time, determine the falsifying criteria, and then conduct the study accordingly. That is what we're advocating. And you don't have to be a researcher to engage in adversarial collaboration. Just seek out people who disagree with you on individual positions. If you're strongly in favor of gun rights, talk to somebody who's strongly in favor of gun control in an open dialogic way, a non-dogmatic way. Keep the terms left-wing and right-wing and you fascist and you commie, keep that out of it. And just talk about the policy, and it's amazing what you will learn. And again, to get back to Tetlock, he had people do this, and their ability to predict and forecast after they collaborated and after they talked to somebody who disagreed on a granular policy went up. The more and more people thought about, you're on the left, you're on the right, their intelligence literally went down. The more they talked about individual policies in a dialogic, open-ended, open-minded, non-dogmatic, and conciliatory way, the more their intelligence increased. It's pretty amazing. So I think those few little strategic shifts could do wonders.
I'm with you. I'm careful. I don't think I tend to say left-wing, right-wing on the show. I do say progressive and conservative, although red and blue would probably be better monikers for that because I am describing a team. I'm not really describing something essential to it. I'd add, you point out in the book, adding right-wing or left-wing as a preface to a statement is really just a way of weaponizing it. So if I say he's super right-wing on abortion, or he's a right-winger pro-life guy, what I'm really doing is just queuing up everybody that agrees with me that he's either on our team or he's not on our team. It actually isn't providing anything useful in terms of information. You could just say he is very pro-life or he is very pro-choice. But when you start adding he's super conservative, he's super progressive, now you're talking about team monikers as opposed to issue-specific monikers. So talking about issues specifically or talking about teams, but trying to merge them, avoid doing that.
Well, what people do when they add those appellations, oh, he's a right-wing anti-abortion activist, or he's a right-wing tax cut advocate. The reason they add the term right-wing is to try to create false association. They don't think they're adding tribal labels. They think they're adding substantive labels. So you could just say something informational. He's opposed to abortion. That's true. There's nothing controversial about that. That is informational. That's good. You add right-wing, and now you're saying, guess who he's like? You know who else was right-wing, don't you? Adolf Hitler, Stephen A. Douglas, right. John Calhoun, white supremacists. So if he's opposed to abortion, I've thrown in the word right-wing so that you know the company he keeps. Does he keep that company? You
know that if he, that guy seems okay, but if you gave him enough power and amphetamine, he would be Hitler. Because ultimately, that guy and Hitler are of the same mold.
Yeah.
Or that guy, that if you gave Joe Biden enough nootropical vitamin supplements, he would become Joseph Stalin because they're of the same mold. I also find that people use the term moderate becomes I typically, when I use the term moderate, I'm referring to a set of temperamental elements. So when I say moderate, I mean, I might be wrong. I have friends I disagree with. I'm open to evidence, things like that, right? But typically when we use moderate and referring to conservative or progressive, We just mean guy I like. That's it. So Ted Cruz is a extreme right-wing Republican because we don't like him. George Will, he's a moderate Republican because he's okay. But like when you actually sit down and look, like I honestly don't know. I've never done a point-by-point comparison of what they disagree on, but they might agree on a bunch of stuff. I don't know. But I know who's going to be the extreme right-winger. We're like Adam Gopnik, moderate Democrat, because he seems like a smart, nice Democrat that I'd go have dinner with. So he's a moderate Democrat, whereas AOC, extreme left-winger, because she's crazy, right? It just ends up being like a feeling as opposed to any type of actual longitudinal element along that spectrum, because the spectrum's fake.
Sure. And people make the confusion between policy extremism and rhetorical extremism too, right? So
yeah.
Did Donald Trump take all these, right-wing policies that are currently considered right-wing, small government and anti-abortion, militarism, and then just extremize them as extremely anti-government, as extremely in favor of military action? No. So why does everybody say he's an extreme right-winger? It's his rhetoric. He uses angry rhetoric, extreme rhetoric, yes. But extreme rhetoric is an extreme policy, and the political spectrum makes you think it is. Oh, he's on the far right, then he must be in favor of all these fascist policies, right? And Senator McCarthy was brilliant at this. This is how he got so much power, was by weaponizing the political spectrum, using a false model. He'd say, look, anyone who opposes me, if you're a liberal, and if you oppose me, it's because you're a liberal, and we know what happens when you take liberalism to an extreme. You're suddenly a commie. So people who simply believed in free speech are suddenly communists. Is that because you moderately believe in free speech, but if you believe in it too much, you suddenly become Joseph Stalin because you're so in favor of free speech?
The archon of freedom of speech, Joseph Stalin, yeah.
Right. But that's what Senator McCarthy was implying. It was absolutely absurd. So it's a tool of misinformation here that people use to gain power, to confuse, to drum up support, and it's not a tool for understanding. So if we believe, like you and I do, that understanding is superior to hatred and misunderstanding, well, then it's got to go. And then you use the word moderate. I guess I'm not opposed to that word. Again, there are spectral connotations, right? Oh, there's extremes and then there's a middle. I might just use more the word independent. I just don't agree with, I'm not on this stupid spectrum.
Yeah.
Right? And you were pointing that out earlier, the idea that you're a moderate if you extremely believe in gun rights and also extremely believe in abortion rights. Well, you've got two extremist positions. You're not going to fit on that spectrum. And moderate suggests you were, I take the middle ground on abortion, I take the middle ground on gun control. That's wrong. You're independent, though. You don't follow tribe. Good for you. I'm a big fan of people who don't follow tribe, even if I disagree with them.
Well, and like you raise a good point as well on the rhetoric being, if we're accepting the social theory of ideology, which I very much accept, promulgated in your book, people are keying off of how teensy are you. They're not keying off of what you actually think. They care more about the words you're using to describe what you think than what you think, because the words you're using are coloring whether you're red team or blue team. And it's like, for example, this is such a random thing, but I spent a lot of time in the United Kingdom. Last year when I was in Scotland, the Queen died, and I was talking to my British friends. I sound like a Tory to my Scottish friends, and so we would be discussing the monarchy and stuff, and I go, well, I like the idea of there being a ceremonial head of state that doesn't have any power. I think that's really smart. I would nationalize the Duchy of Cornwall. I would nationalize the Duchy of Somerset, and I was considered a monarchist, and I literally just said, I want to take 80% of the monarchy's income and redistribute it across the United Kingdom. But I was considered a monarchist because I phrased it in this very like guy with elbow patches in chair kind of lingo. But no one in the United Kingdom saying that. That's the most like radical position in the UK right now. But I'm a moderate because I sound like it. Anyway, I know you've got a meeting, so I will let you go. But keep fighting the good fight, Professor. Your book is The Myth of Left and Right, How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. I commend it to the audience, and in particular for people that were hearing us preach to the chorus. I really enjoyed the history that you did in it, and then learning about the retconning of left-right history in the American experience. And it's a good and quick book, so thank you so much. That's the show. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Hyrum Lewis, for coming on to discuss the illusion of the left-right spectrum. Thank you, Eric Stipe, who edited today's program. Until next time, I've been Andrew Heaton, and so have you.